Hello and welcome back to class. Today we will be reviewing in this demonstration video assignment 3, pattern for 2D design. This assignment is going to be a really complex as well as a really amazing project for everyone to dive into, and I hope you learn a lot out of it. Okay, so to begin, like all assignments in this class, we really do try to kind of build upon that base knowledge which was already learned about with previous assignments. So in this assignment, we're also going to be carrying forward that base foundation knowledge which we've already gained from assignment 1, assignment 2, and sketchbooks A, B, and C. So we're going to be re-emphasizing and of course practicing those kind of developments in line, form, shape, value, and color, as well as working on and continuing to develop those critical concepts of composition building through balance strategies, balance formulas, as well as Gestalt theory. So always keep that in the back of your mind as we progress through the course. We're not forgetting any of that information learned, but rather we're incorporating it and adding on to that base knowledge. So areas of art and or elements of art and principles of design that we're going to be emphasizing and learning about pretty heavy in this particular unit and assignment are going to be pattern, rhythm, unity, variety, and economy. In addition to that, we're going to be building on and continuing to develop our color theory knowledge in terms of color mixing and working more specifically with color schemes for this assignment. In addition to all that great stuff, we're also going to be introducing concept building. So we're going to be teaching you how to essentially develop a good concept, how to start visually researching, and how to start organizing images and color schemes to really create a form dictates concept theme. And so when I say that term, form dictates content, that is going to be kind of our motto as we move forward in this class. We want to start making really effective images that really have symbols and use the elements of art and principles of design to really capture and portray a message to the viewer. So when you talk about form, that's going to be those elements of art, principles of design, and that's going to be dictating content, right? So really channel that thought, channel that idea for this project and as we move forward in this class. Okay, so after all of this great introduction, of course, this is just a recap on things that we've already introduced, but it's always good to recap. We're going to be really making essentially a motif tile for this class. This is going to be a hand-drawn kind of tile, which then you will repeat and turn into a larger hand-drawn repeating pattern. This is going to be an all-over pattern design that is really developed around a concept inspired by the natural sciences. So in this video, we're going to be really developing and kind of diving into step 1, the science of nature and research process. Step 2, the motif sketch, and I'm going to be talking you through this process as well as explaining and giving you some really great visual examples for how to complete it. And step 3, developing the final pattern. So I'm going to talk about how we do this, and don't worry if this does seem a little bit overwhelming. Just stop, pause, or rewatch the video as many times as you need. I will thoroughly break down all of the processes and techniques that I'm using to create this project. This project's also going to be a really great and very useful assignment for teaching you how to create a really thought-provoking as well as a really beautiful hand-designed pattern. And that can really serve you in a variety of different fields, whether you're going to go into the fine arts, whether you're going to go into the design arts, or if you take up kind of commissioned works where you work as a designer and you're creating hand-drawn things. So this pattern assignment is going to teach you some really valuable skills that can be applied in a lot of job settings. So have fun with this, be creative, and really flex those beautiful mind muscles of yours. All right, let's go ahead and dive into step 1, the science of nature research process. So this is relatively kind of a short little written description here, but it's a pretty good, thorough introduction into designing a research process and really breaking down the steps in a very kind of like easy to use kind of way. So feel free to not only use this in this project, but also follow this process throughout your careers as an artist as well as in other classes, because it's a really good guaranteed way to organize thoughts and create that visual archive for you as an artist to be inspired by. And we're going to talk about what a visual archive is and the research process and research paper that you will need to turn in for this assignment. So, all right, in step one, you'll be focusing on the research end of the assignment, aka this is where we're going to build our concept, okay? In step two and step three, you'll be designing and painting/drawing your composition that will reflect the natural sciences. As I've mentioned, we're going to be making a concept that is inspired by the science of nature, right? So we're going to be targeting ecological species or specimens that are revolving around the listed kind of categories that I have posted here. So insects, birds, reptiles, mammals, fish, rocks or minerals, and or plants. Just as long as that concept is revolving around any one of those kind of forms, you're going to have a great time with this project, okay? And in fact, this project is totally about you and your voice. So you're going to be able to really have fun with this, make this your own, and develop some great autonomy with this particular assignment. So have fun with it and pick a topic that you're passionate or really interested in, okay? In fact, that's what I exactly want you to do for this assignment because it's going to make it 10 times funner and you're going to really be able to produce some beautiful works, okay? All right, so let's dive into what the process is, and I'm going to walk you through step by step on how to answer these questions. So the research process, essentially it's going to be question one here, and then this alphanumeric A through D questions. So what I'm actually going to recommend you to do to answer this part of the assignment is I'm going to actually copy paste from the research process all the way down to question D, just copy paste that, and then bring it into a Google Doc. So simply type in Google Docs on your search bar. I've got it saved here, so I'm just going to go ahead and push my little hotkey for it. My little saved icon, open up a blank document, and then paste that information in. You can go ahead and delete this little section since you will not need that for your turn-in page. But essentially, you are going to answer your questions, which are listed here. This is essentially like a preface question that sets up A through D, the questions that you'll be answering. So you're really going to focus on answering A, B, C, and D completely and thoroughly for this part of the assignment. I will be asking you to turn in this question. In fact, that is clearly stated right down here. Turn in your answer and research document on Canvas with the final project. All right, so that is clearly listed under step one. Just in case you forget or if you need help reminding, move down to step 4 for the instructor turn in and submission section. You will see that it's clearly labeled as the first kind of item in order here, answering and visual research document for step 1. So that's all clearly labeled and very easy to find. So make sure that you do save this information, that it's clearly labeled and downloaded or saved somewhere that is easy to access and turn in. I'm going to go ahead and title my research process paper. So research process, assignment 3, and we'll just say paper, okay? This is now saved on Google Docs. If you've never downloaded a Google Doc, it's pretty easy. You're going to simply click File over here. It's going to push down a drop-down menu. Then you're going to go to the Download section. The caret is going to generate a little menu folder over to the right, and you're going to either download a Microsoft Word document or a PDF document. The big difference is Microsoft Word documents that can be edited after the fact. So if you need to go back and add information to that, I would recommend saving a Word document. If you like the formatting and you are nervous that the formatting might change, then I would recommend downloading a PDF file. Usually I tend to turn in PDF files because they're really easy files that have an established format and they don't change compared to your machine preference, right? If you're working on a Mac, it's going to look and read the same if you open it up on a PC and vice versa. So I tend to work with PDFs and then I'll just edit as I need on my blank page. And when I go to turn it in, I would just recommend turning it in on a PDF. But do whatever you want. I do give you that option there. All right, so let's talk about answering these questions. So this is a research paper, but it's not going to be an atypical research paper. And what I mean by that is this is an artist research paper. So there's going to be a lot of emphasis on the visual component, or particularly the visual research process. So if you've never heard the term visual research, what that physically implies is talking about mining visual data or information and using that as kind of a visual archive to set up essentially as a tool for you to access or use as a resource for inspiration for your projects. And so when we're talking about this kind of research process in your research paper, I really want you to get into the habit of thinking about image files or this kind of image archive that you're going to be collecting and making out of a variety of different images that you source from the internet or books or magazines, okay? So visual research, just to be kind of clear here, can be done in a variety of different ways. You can start with a basic Google search, and this might be on a topic that you're particularly interested in. Let's say if you are really interested in bees, maybe you start there. If you're interested in pandas, you start there. Or perhaps, you're not really necessarily interested in a particular species, but rather a habitat. Perhaps you're interested in the Galapagos Islands, and you maybe start with Galapagos Islands, and from there you find a species that you're really interested in. Say you're really interested in the finch, which is a keystone species for the habitat on the Galapagos Islands, and then you can construct a whole entire narrative or concept around the finch that is occupying the Galapagos Islands, right? So that's a great place to start. So after you've saved your paper, you can start answering this and just going along the lines of answering these questions. Now, I've already got a research paper set up for you, which can be clearly found on this highlighted orange section here. Click here for a research example document. So this is going to be a really helpful tool for those of you who are struggling on the research component, or you might want a little bit of clarity on what I am asking for. You can simply click the Here button, which is going to drop down a link. Click the link and it's going to open up this page. Now this page essentially is all of the questions that I ask, clearly listed here from 1A through D, and then I essentially just answer them. So I want this to be a guide or serve as a guide for how you should go about answering and filling in or completing this part of the assignment, okay? So use this as a tool, a guide to kind of give you clarity on how to organize information and also what kind of information I'm asking for. So I'm going to use this as kind of our teaching tool and our visual example, and I'm going to walk you through the steps and how I've answered them, okay? So, identify and list 3 areas of interest within a habitat or ecological specimen or specimens. So, I have listed out 3 areas of interest that I have. Now, most likely, just talking through this video or after being introduced to this assignment, you most likely have already kind of have some kind of specimens or maybe areas of interest that you have. Like I said, this can be inspired by particularly like a type of ecosystem, like waterways here, or this can also be an insect, rock, bird, mineral, mammal, all that good stuff. So like I said, if you're interested in pandas, you make your work about pandas. If you're interested in rocks, you can make it about rocks or mushrooms, whatever, right? As long as you have a clear, definitive kind of established specimen that you're going to be working off and surrounding your concept around that specimen and a topic that relates to that specimen, you're going to be absolutely fine for this part of the process, okay? I just want you to find something and make it organized and make a good image from it, okay? So remember, form dictates content. So this is going to be where we start introducing this term and start developing a concept of visual research. So we're going to look at a variety of different habitats, ecological species or specimens, and how they function, right? So we're going to be looking at some areas where these species might work geographically, how they maybe influence their ecosystems or their environments, areas maybe they eat from, or maybe how they kind of affect their kind of local flora and fauna, all that good stuff. And we're going to do that through visual research. Now, as I mentioned, we can start off with a very simple kind of visual research tool, which is just simply going to Google and doing a Google image search. So type in Google and then type in, like I did, bees here, and then go to Google Images. Now, let's say if you want to find some really nice images, I'll give you some cool tricks on how to navigate and better use Google Images. You'll go over here to Tools, click on Tools, and then go over to Sizes, and you can actually find larger sizes of images. Now, this might be particularly of use to you if you're going to print off some of these images and you don't want them to be pixelated. So this has a lot of detail features that are really beautiful with little pollen on the bee hair, and maybe you want to capture that for your pattern. So it might be nice to have a really large image of this. You'll simply just copy paste the image. I'm going to right click the image right now and go down to copy image, and then I'll simply paste that into my Google document. Space. I'm pasting it, and then you can reformat the image to fit it. The great thing about Google Docs is it does have this nice sizing tool. It's very easy to use. You simply just click on the image. These little box points will pop up, and then you just hover over with your mouse on the box point, and you can expand it to as small or as large as you want. This is also where it's going to be really helpful when you go to print or when you work off of an image. If you're working from a larger image already, that pixel size is going to be able to translate well and be expanded. If it's a smaller image, you know the larger you make the image, the more pixelated it'll get. So just keep that in mind when Googling and doing your image searches. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and maybe get rid of one of these just so we can have a little bit more space here. All right, so here we go. All right, so I'm going to develop essentially 3 areas of interest based off of that. Now, other areas that you might want to search visually and to create this kind of visual narrative or this visual research is maybe things like Pinterest. Pinterest is a great tool for artists. In fact, I use it quite a bit. In my own research, you can see all the food interests that I have and all of the art interests that I have. So Pinterest is a great tool, however, for artists because it is a visual archive system, right? So it not only links, areas of a topic, but it'll also link subtopics in that are related. So you can be able to find diagrams or schematics of a bee in my example here. You can also be able to find maybe other kind of areas that can relate to bees, such as maybe the pollen that's collected there. You can look at how the beehives work, the kind of life and death cycle of bees, their geographic areas, the honey bee life cycle, and how it works in terms of creating and cultivating farmed honey, and just a variety of other areas. The great thing about Pinterest too is that it sounds like I'm selling Pinterest. I'm not. It's just a good tool for artists. But the other great thing is too, you can find illustrations. So if you don't have a great exposure to like the art world in general, and to be perfectly honest, like I wouldn't know an artist right off the top of my head that works with bees particularly, like a fine artist. So this would be a really good tool for me just to use to see how different people are handling bees, right? How they're drawing them, how they're creating like forms. Even just this, I just found this, and this is actually a really beautiful way to paint a bee, right? They're using kind of wet on wet techniques here with watercolor, and it's kind of naturally blending with some of the black and the yellow, and it's kind of bleeding into each other. This might be a beautiful way to create your pattern. And this is also something talking about your visual research process and why it's so important. This will help give you ideas and start getting your brain to think about how you're going to actually create these forms, whether they're going to be more illustrative, whether they're going to be hyper realistic, whether they're going to be more cartoony, whether they're going to have stylization, or whether they're going to have some kind of, watermarks, or they're going to have a lot of material sensibility developed into the way you're handling or creating the forms. So your visual research component is going to be a really vital key process for this research and concept building that you're doing for this assignment. So any of the kind of illustrations that you're finding here, any of the artworks that you're finding, this is all great tools and all great images for your research. Simply copy paste and bring them on over here to your document. Okay, so come up with 3 areas of search for this section to answer this completely, right? Because I'm asking for 3 areas of interest for you. So I've got bees here, or the bee crisis, graphite mining. Particularly I'm looking at like graphite and how it's mined in East Germany and the affect on the kind of ecosystem there. Also the clean water crisis. This is of course a huge area of interest for me right now, because this is a pretty hot topic, and it's also pretty devastating what's happening with the ecosystems revolving around water. So I've got 3 different areas relating to garbage, refuse or waste or pollutions or pollutants going into our waterways or ocean systems, as well as green algae that is blooming and the kind of high rapid rates of green algae blooms. So I've got images here. That's all great. After you've answered and labeled them out and found some pictures to go along with them, then you can go ahead and move on to answering question B. Create a research question or statement. Now, if you've never heard of a research question or statement, this really is kind of a great way to organize your thoughts, because it definitively gets to the heart of the issue or an area that is very specific that you're interested in. So for me, I have kind of chosen the bee crisis is going to be my issue that I'm interested in, and then I have developed a research statement around the bee crisis. Now, essentially what you're going to do is you're going to look at all three of the areas that you have already researched up here for question A, and you're going to essentially pick one of those topics. The reason I ask you to look for three in question A is just primarily to give you some choice and to think about what you actually want to research. Through your visual research process, you might decide that you actually want to go with clean waterways, or you might want to develop something else just because you don't like any of the way these three are working. And if so, then you're going to make a different kind of project, right? So for me, I have decided that the bee crisis and the death rate of bees in North America is something that I really want to focus on and develop a research statement about. You can either do this in question form or statement form. For this particular project, I just ended up doing a statement. So I am interested in the bee crisis and its impact on farming and agriculture in North America. All right, so this is pretty good in terms of a research statement. It's to the point. When I talk about the bee crisis, I could be probably a little bit more specific here and talk about bee or the death of large colonies of bees and its impact on farming and agriculture in North America. But I talk about its impact, so I'm talking about the cause and effect relationship on farming and agriculture, and then I give us a location, North America, right? So I give us a very kind of specific species that I'm focusing on and its affect on a particular ecosystem, and I give us that general geographic area, all right? So this is a pretty good research statement. So after you've developed a research statement, and like I said, think critically about what you want to say, what you want to target with that area of ecological specimens or specimen, and develop a research statement that is succinct and in one sentence, okay? All right, after that is completed, then you can go ahead and move on to answering question C. Question C is going to ask you to gather more specific data. So I want you to foster not only visual research that is related to the topic of your research statement, but also non-visual data to help build your understanding of your topic. So this is going to go into a little bit more of that atypical kind of research paper. You're going to start collecting non-visual data. So articles that maybe are reflective of that topic that you're interested in. You can simply do this by quick Google searches. And talking about maybe those topics that you're interested in. Now, granted, I had a very specific topic. I'm interested in the kind of collapsing of bee colonies and massive bee colony death in North America, and I'm looking at the impact on agriculture. So I essentially typed in a variety of different search terms that were kind of very similar for my research statement, and I was able to find three really good articles. I read all of these articles, and I was able to derive that there is a particular mite that is infecting bee populations in North America and is causing massive death and collapse of bee colonies in North America. So this one in particular talks about a variety of different bees, mites that happen, and not only in America, but in the United Kingdom. So this had some just generally good information for me to start sourcing. It also made me kind of look at different bees. It also introduced a new species for me to target. So this also might happen too in your research process. You might discover that perhaps that you end up targeting two species in your project. So, and that's fine too. So I've got this really great article. I read through it thoroughly. In fact, I found three different articles, so I simply just copy paste the URL links. I do expect you to read through your articles. They're going to give you a better understanding of how that information is going to feed into your topic. So please do your due diligence, read through that information, and be critical with your analysis of that data. So after that, I had a much more informed kind of knowledge base, so that changed my Google searches and my visual research that I was mining. So I started looking at these bee mites that are infesting honeybees, and I particularly looked up honeybees that were in North America. So these are North American honeybee species, as well as the mites that are associated of affecting those honeybee colonies. I just found some random kind of images of kind of plants that are around general North American geographic farms. And this isn't a great part of my search, but I just kind of put these in for placeholders till I can find maybe a more specific area to represent the farming and agricultural communities. So I know that I have to kind of come back and look here, and this is going to lead me into answering question D. This is going to get us into our last kind of component of our research process. And this is synthesizing and extracting important information from those previous questions asked, right? So we've done visual data. We have both mined a lot of research for visual information as well as non-visual information. And now we're going to try to connect our ideas. So even if they're far-reaching ones, I want you to start figuring out how these areas fit together, how your research is feeding into a larger concept or an overall theme. And this is maybe where you can start tweaking your research statement or research question. You do another image search and find better images to convey your ideas, right? Going back to that idea of form dictates content. How we can start playing with shape, scale, size, perspective, viewpoint, stylization, or color system that is going to be associated with our specimens, and how we can better convey a more interesting narrative to our viewer, all right? So for me, I went back and I kind of researched some more honeybees and kind of the mites that are affecting them, and maybe areas of North America where the honeybee death population is a really kind of critical issue for the cultivation of particular species. And the species that I found that was really greatly affected in North America were almonds. So this gets us back into answering that a little bit more specific question that I had kind of an area of issue with, right? Like I didn't necessarily in section C here, after reading my 3 articles, doing a lot of research on them, I didn't really know how to represent the farmland or agricultural kind of landscape in a really definitive and effective way. I just found some really kind of lazy images. But here I got much more specific after I did more research, and I really thought about those connections a lot more. So this is why I'm saying this connection part is really critical, and you want to be specific here so you can make a better image. So I went back and I did some more visual researches on Google searches as well as Pinterest searches, and I even looked at social media too, and just looked at some almond farm pictures, right? And I found some almond farmed pictures here, as well as almonds coming out of the flower, kind of flowers and almonds growing simultaneously together. I found a couple more bees and mite pictures, as well as a variety of different bee shapes of particular bee species in North America that are very specific to California. So I found a couple different sizes of them. These are larger images, so I was able to scale them up and scale them down. And I just got a lot more specific with my search and the areas that I was trying to focus and highlight. Okay, so then I actually wrote down my thoughts. So for step D, or question D, I really want you to kind of summarize and synthesize your information that you've gathered from your questions and answering from A through C, and just elaborate on them in step D, or in question D, excuse me. My research statement is, once again, I kind of added it here. I think I would technically go back and tweak this now since it's changed a little bit. I might say the farming and agricultural community as it pertains to almond farmers in North America. And I would talk about when I say bee colony collapse. All right. So I would be a little bit more specific. And I think this is where my research statement would change. So after this video, I might go back and even change it too, so you can have that better example. But all of that being said, I would have my research, an updated research statement here. And then I would go in and kind of link why I may be making some of the decisions that I'm making for images. So I'm looking at articles that are talking about almonds and fruits and the almond nut and how it's being pollinated. And it's really critical for bees to pollinate those trees to produce the almond fruit or the almond nut. So without bees, right, the whole entire system would collapse. So I talk about the kind of linking again to the mites and how they're affecting to large population deaths in bees, especially in North America. And then I talk about, too, color schemes. So this is going to give us a good idea about how you're thinking about a color scheme and how it's going to work into your concept. I'm going to go with either split complementary or a tetradic color scheme, primarily because it also inspires unity, because there is a kind of contrast with its or a complement to its use on the color wheel, but as well as there's kind of a natural fight or duality that's listed there because they're color complements or they're right across each other on the color wheel. So there's some variety and unity also both dividing those kind of spaces. And I think that makes a lot of sense for what I'm talking about, right? So I think that just that color scheme really makes a lot of sense. So I'm talking about it from there. All right, so that's going to conclude our research statement. Now, once again, you could find this document clearly listed on step 1, the science of nature research process, just by clicking here. And of course, I do want to see your own work, so don't be picking a bee colony crisis and using the exact information that I pulled. But you can use this as a guide to help you through the research process for formatting and seeing how I'm answering the questions to give you some better clarity on it, okay? Make sure you research, answer, and save those documents and turn this in with your final project. All right, now we will move on to step 2 and demonstrating the motif sketch, how to complete it, and what the motif sketch is. To introduce step 2, we're going to actually jump back over to our assignment page, and I'm going to talk about step 2, the motif sketch. To kind of answer what we're doing in this particular area or in this step of the project, we're going to be making a sketch. In fact, we're going to be making 2 to 3 potential final project motif patterns. So I'm going to ask you to make 2 or 3 sketches, essentially motif sketches, for your final project. The reason I'm asking you to create 2 or 3 sketches is primarily because often the first sketch that we make isn't that good, and we can probably do better on our second or third attempt. This is pretty much a proven fact almost. I really hate saying proven facts in art because it's just asking for somebody to contradict me. But in general, this is a really good rule to apply. Usually the first time we do something, there's just kind of something usually missing. So if the second attempt and the third attempt will usually have a much more developed kind of understanding of the pattern, the design process, and all that good stuff. In fact, my first design that I make isn't that good compared to my second design that I make. I will be showing you how to create a motif sketch 2 different ways. The first method that I'm going to be using is going to be using or relying on tracing paper. It's called a tracing paper method. And this is going to be for students who don't have a lot of familiarity with drawing or they feel uncomfortable when drawing. This will really allow you to kind of copy and paste or transfer images using a tracing paper and your carbon paper. So if you are interested in that, feel free to use tracing paper and carbon paper to complete this part of the assignment. If you have some understanding of drawing or if you like drawing and have some good sensibilities for it, also feel free to just observational sketch or draw. I do that in my second attempt for my pattern, so feel free to have fun with that. You can also mix and match and both use sketching processes as well as transfer processes to create your motif sketches. All right, so to summarize what we'll be doing in this particular part of the assignment, we are going to be making a motif. And I give you a definition here, which is a little bit generic, but the way that I really want you to think about this is I want you to use this visual example that I give you actually in your project page. We are going to be creating a single kind of motif. And I really want you to think about it. When I say the word motif, I want you to think about mosaic tile. We're going to be essentially creating a singular motif design. And then in step 3, we're going to be stamping that design to create a larger pattern. Okay, so think about the motif as a type of tile that you are going to repeat then later multiple times to create a larger overall pattern in step 3. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the motif kind of process, how we're going to go ahead and create our design using both a transfer method, using tracing paper and carbon paper, and then also how to hand draw it. I'm also going to be demonstrating a very kind of technical mosaic kind of technique that can be easily found for instructions on our step 2 here and making a motif instructions. So feel free to pause, rewatch the video as many times as you need, or work alongside me when I get to this process for making the motif tile, because it can be a little bit complicated and there's going to be cutting involved. So let's go ahead and show you some examples of what I'll be making and just break this down a little bit further. On the screen, I'm going to put down 2 motif examples. I'm going to be demonstrating how I made these motif tiles in just a few moments. But to begin with, this is my first example. I will be showing you how to make this first, and then my hand-drawn example, I'll be showing you how to make this second. My first tile here, which is presented, or my motif tile, is presented to you on the left. This is my first attempt. I also used a tracing paper method to create this. I will show you how to use tracing paper methods to make a motif tile like the one on the left. And then this is my hand-drawn example on the right. I have a pretty strong background in drawing, so I ended up opting to go with my motif tile on the right. I will show you, of course, how to problem solve and how you can think about creating both of these using different methods. As I mentioned, there is a large drawing component in this assignment. And if you don't have a lot of background knowledge on drawing, or if you feel uncomfortable with drawing, I totally get it. That's why I'm offering you a kind of solution to that problem and using a tracing paper method. I will show you how to work with tracing paper if you feel like you want to utilize that for this particular project. As you can see, I do it here, and then I've got my drawn method over on the right hand side. So I give you a couple of options on how to complete this. Of course, you can go back and forth between the two. Let's go ahead and demonstrate how I am going to complete a motif tile for step 2. We're going to go and look at our size requirements for this project. So I do give you some listed image sizes for our final end project, our final pattern. And they're going to be anywhere from 9 by 13 to 11 by 11 or larger. So I have some minimum size requirements posted to begin with, or I could go larger if I want to for this project. For me, I'm thinking 11 by 11, that's going to be kind of like a weirder motif size. 11 divided by 2, that's going to be like 5.5, right? So I'm not sure if I'm totally wanting to do that. I might just want a nice even number, so I'm going to make my image 12 by 12. So I'm going to go with the square composition. Of course, you can go for rectangle compositions. I've got them clearly listed here. You can play around with those numbers and adjust them as you need, but the minimum size is 9 by 13. So you can also kind of make a different size motif if you want, and then just kind of pattern it out and sparse it out in that kind of border area. But I want mine to be kind of an equal relationship, so I'm going to go ahead and just scale mine up to 12 by 12, so that way I make a 6 by 6 motif. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward us through the cutting process. I am working with a 12 by 12 final product, so that means I'm going to have to make a 6 by 6 motif. So what I am doing is just cutting down my basic sketchbook and drawing paper. It doesn't really necessarily matter what kind of paper you're working with for this particular process. I'm just working with some kind of scrap drawing paper that I had laying around the house. So I'm being really careful here to make sure that my motif paper that I'm cutting down is exactly 6 by 6. This motif paper is then going to be duplicated 4 times for my larger 12 by 12 image, and it needs to be exact. So please make sure that you're making those accommodations for any type of wet media. Include maybe a border if you're going to be working with a heavy water or gouache medium, to include a 1/4 border around your larger image, and just be mindful of that when you go to place your motif and copy for your larger pattern. All right, now that my paper has been successfully broken down and I've got these great 6 by 6s, I've got 4 kind of test papers to make my motif on now. So I can start playing around with. So for step 2, we have to have at least 2 to 3 sketches for review that I'm going to be asking you to turn in. This is just going to help you on the kind of evaluation process, the sketching process. And so that's why I'm asking you to make 2 or 3, because your first try often isn't always your best try. So the more you sketch, the more practice you get, the better off your compositions are going to be, and the better off your images are going to be. So that's why I'm having you do at least 2 or 3. All right, I've got a 4th one here just in case, like I said, I screw up and I want to start over. So that's good. But the basic idea is we're going to be making one sketch, or we're going to be picking one sketch of our motif, and then essentially we're going to be kind of just stamping that out on our larger page. So my overall image is going to be 12 by 12, as you can see here, 6 by 6, 6 by 6, 6 by 6, 6 by 6. So I'm going to actually be able to stamp this 4 times to make my larger pattern. So let's go ahead and talk about the sketching process. Now, I've mentioned multiple times that there's kind of different ways that you can handle this project. There's not just one way that you can do it. I'm going to give you a couple examples of some ways that you can think about the project or handle the project. And so hopefully this will give you some better clarity, as well as some kind of ideas to kind of work around areas if maybe you're feeling uncomfortable. Particularly if you don't feel like you're a strong drawer or if you don't have a lot of drawing experience, there are some kind of alternatives for this practice or process. And that's, like I said, using your tracing paper. Tracing paper, as I mentioned, is a semi-transparent paper. It's really light. You can basically see large kind of characteristics for printed objects underneath it, and then you just essentially trace and record that information on top of the sheet itself. So this is going to all really rely on you having all of that wonderful research data printed out. So here are some prints, some just black and white prints that I did. You can do this at the library for pretty reasonable cost. I'm just printing off essentially my research, my visual research that I did in step 1. So as you can see, I've got my bees here. I've got multiple different scaled shapes of bees. This is going to be really important, especially when it comes to tracing, because then essentially I'm just going to take my tracing paper on top, outline that bee form, and then have that little bee, and then I can kind of move it around on my page. So I've got a variety of different scaled bees that I'll be using, or specimens that I'll be using. I've got a couple of different examples of almonds, almond fruits as they're budding, those flowers of the almond fruit, as well as different scaled sizes and shapes of all of that good information. And I even have some different bees in the background in different positions. Like I said, different scales and sizes. You get the idea at this point, right? So I've got a variety of different images that I can pull from and source when I am working on this particular project. And that's going to be really helpful for my design process. So I can go in and say, okay, what do I want to have here? What kind of background patterns do I want to have? How do I want to have my bees interacting with some of this information? How do I want to show those mites? This is all going to be really good food for thought, and it's going to be absolutely necessary that you have some good resource images to make your overall design pattern. Your design pattern, that's going to be really up to you. In a lot of ways, this project does really flex your creativity muscles, if you will, because you're going to have to be making decision processing here, and really coming up with an image that is solely yours, solely unique to you and your voice and your concept. So that's why I really stress that kind of visual research process in step 1, so you can do that well. So I'm going to actually begin with maybe some sketching here. I'm going to find a couple of different bees that I like, and let's see, I'm going to maybe go with this little bee right here, and I'm going to take my sketching paper, and I'm just going to kind of demo how to do this really quickly in case you're curious. I'm going to take my sketching paper, and I'm going to take a little bit of tape just so my sketching paper doesn't move in the middle of my sketch, and I'm going to essentially just tape it down really quickly. Remember, you want to make sure you're using a low tack tape like painter's tape or a delicate paper tape. I've got this delicate paper tape here, and I'm just kind of doing it a little bit willy-nilly where I'm putting it. Doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to take a mechanical pencil. You can also use a 2H, something with a little bit hardened lead that's going to be a little bit easier for tracing, but won't dull down the point too much. And then essentially I'm just going to draw this information out as I see it. And there might be areas too where your tracing paper it's kind of hard to make out some of the individual characters or components. So it might be important too to have your tracing paper a little loose in some areas where you can go back and maybe peel up some of that tape and just see where some of those forms are laying. So you could go back in and say, okay, there's the eye right there, and we've got some of the bee head right here. We've got bee antenna right here. Okay. That'll just be a good little tip here when we work. Gonna grab some of that hair. And you can be as detailed as you want or as minimal as you want on these sketches. It's really just going to depend on how you're going to make your design for this particular project. Because remember, you are designing this project. It's your voice. and then I'll go ahead and just add his stripes down at the bottom. Or her stripes, or their stripes. Whatever kind of stripes. Alright, that looks pretty good to me. And too, like I'm doing right here, I'm just adding little details as I see them. And the bee, just to make my drawing a little bit more particular and a little bit more accurate. All right, good. So I've got a good sketch of a bee now. I like it pretty well. I'm going to go ahead and just take off my tape real quick. And now I've got a great little bee that I can use for my drawing. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab some scissors. So scissors will also be really important, I think, for this project, especially if you are going to be using your tracing paper heavily. I think even too, if you do have good drawing experience, I actually really like using the tracing paper method because it makes your images a little bit more fluid, so you can work with them a little bit more organically, and you can kind of really, in real time, quickly see how your image is going to look and play around with your composition a little bit more easily. All right, so I'm just going to cut that out and make it a little bit more specific. The reason I'm cutting it out is essentially I want my image to be really movable. And what I mean by that is that if I want to flip it upside down, I can do that. It won't, of course. I can see it pretty well here. I might not be registering so well in the camera just because of the angle of the light. But I really want my image to be kind of movable and flexible, so I can start moving them around on the page. I've also kind of drawn some other sketches. I'm just going to turn this around so we can have a better lit area. You can see them pop out a little bit more with that contrast. But I want to have some other options for me available. So these are some other sketches that I did on my spare time just to prep for this video. But as you can see, now I've got multiple bees in different positions and at different scales. So this could add a lot of dimension and a lot of character to your motif just by scaling differences. I've also got some really nice kind of flowers here. I've got some individual flowers. I've got flowers on a branch. And then I've got also flowers with those almonds. So I've got some real nice variety here, some really nice shapes, different scales, different sharpnesses, different contrasts. I do kind of stylize them a little bit. I'm taking kind of what I've learned from our sketchbook bee, our portrait, black and white portrait with 5 values, and I'm taking some of those critical skills that I learned there, defining those shapes with value, and I'm translating it into this particular image. So I actually think this image is pretty successful because I like more of that graphic sensibility. The flower's a little bit more stylized and a little bit more graphic, but I'm thinking it's pretty interesting at this point. So I'm liking the way this is looking. And I'm thinking this might be a really good kind of main point in my composition. So what I've got now is I'm actually just going to start layering these on my drawing paper, my motif paper here in the background. Remember, this is that 6x6 dimension that I cut down and worked out. And what I'm actually going to do is just start playing around with my forms a little bit and start seeing maybe how I want this composition to work or feel. If I like the scale of this bee versus that bee more, if I like the position of this bee versus that bee more. Maybe I want to start playing too with more background information. Maybe I think that this isn't busy enough and I want to create some interesting overlap. And maybe I'm starting to like the way this is actually looking. I actually like kind of the way that looks and is functioning. So this is what I mean by having some mobility, some flexibility with your actual motif sketch, is when you transfer them onto the transfer paper, then you're working with the background or you're working with an image that's movable. So then you can literally just start playing around with some different sketches and some different orientations and seeing what works best for this particular project. And like I said, you can be really dynamic here with your sketches. You can have a lot of layered kind of works. As you're noticing, I'm really keeping my sketches more towards the center, and I think that's going to be really important, especially for later processes in step 2, when we flip and actually make our mosaic. I kind of might want another bee here, so I might actually draw another bee. I might have to do it the inverse way. Let's see if I have some different bees here. I've got a lot of different drawings of bees. And I've got a lot of images, so you're going to have to hang on. I might have to do a couple different drawings of bees just to get them worked out right. I really do like this little guy. It's pretty cute, you know? And maybe we just need another almond down there. Maybe that's something too that we can start to play with. And this is what I mean. This is just a part of the sketching process. And I'm just kind of like talking to myself essentially and talking to you about how I'm thinking about putting this thing together. And this is going to be the fun part of this assignment, is that you're going to be able to play a lot with how you're making these forms work together, how you're amplifying them or creating different forms. I might even want to use, that might be kind of big in relationship though. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to use that one after all. Okay, so maybe I'm going to sketch another one here. I might make this one mirror image. So I might sketch this out like I did this one and then actually re-sketch it on the back so it's a little bit brighter. AKA just sketch on the back here. So he'll kind of hang out maybe like that. Or maybe I could just do that and flip it like that. Kind of play around with it. Okay. All right, well, I got to do some more sketching of bees. That's regardless. I'm going to go ahead and speed the video up and just give us a time-lapse segment of me drawing and outlining the bee on the tissue paper. Just remember those good crafting tips. Make sure your tracing paper is taped down through the tracing process and you are looking back and forth between the tracing paper and your image that you're drawing. They are a very nice looking bee now. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and trim this bee out. And I'm actually just going to draw on the back side of it. This is just going to help me see a little bit better on the other side. You'll also notice too when you're tracing this out or copying it on the second time, if you're trying to create like a mirrored image, you'll actually notice that it'll actually start to transfer the image pretty well on the other side just because you have a graphite deposit on the back side. So you might have some fun with that too. I'm trying to be as delicate as possible here with tracing or retracing or re-recording those lines on the other side. See, it makes that ghost reflection. It's about fun. Okay, all right, so now I've got a bee going in the opposite direction, so then I can start playing with these forms a little bit more. Move this a little bit out of the way for us. And start messing around with some of these forms in the background. Now, as I mentioned, I really like this particular drawing. I just like the graphic style of it, some of the forms. And let's see, I like this bee. It's a little empty over on my negative space over here, so I think I'm going to have to maybe push this over a teensy bit. And maybe play with some flowers in the background. Or maybe play with this one in the background. I don't like this drawing as much, just because I think the flowers are a little bit like too stylized. But maybe it could look interesting. Maybe I could take some of that information out. All right, I'm actually really liking the way this is looking though. It's adding enough information. I think I'm gonna add mites maybe in the background, maybe as kind of free floating little things. I might add some mites to the bee kind of disrupting its back area, or maybe even on the thorax. Yeah, or maybe I might just have them scattered in between because they were really, really small and kind of odd looking in some ways. So yeah, I think maybe I'll just kind of add them or scatter them. All right, so once you have a general idea about your sketch, where you want things to lie, what you can start doing is actually taping this down a little bit. So what I mean by that is I'm just actually going to take some tape, and I'm going to make like little tiny pieces of tape, just tearing them up, and taping this little sketch down to one another. Just being really particular and trying not to move it too much, or readjusting it when I do move it. And I'm trying not to cover any lines or marks when I'm making these decisions. So we're going to see. I might play around with this background form a little bit more. I like kind of where it's at because it plays in this positive and negative space really nicely. I could maybe even paint this where it kind of is faded in the background because I like the way that looks. So I might even kind of fade that in. All right, now I'm going to take this piece of tape if I can get it. Okay, I'm going to cut it. And I'm actually going to place this down. All right. Now, I know this seems like a lot of work, but this is a really dope little process. So if you can get it, you can do a lot with it. And of course, you can do this on Photoshop. And in fact, if we were in the classroom face-to-face, we'd be going down to the computer lab and doing this in Photoshop. Because it is a little bit easier. All right, so what you're going to do now is you're going to actually take your carbon paper, right? So we're going to make sure to have the black side, that glossy side with all that heavy dark carbon material. We're going to make sure that that's facing down, okay, on our actual paper. And remember, if you're working with carbon paper, not graphite paper, your carbon's going to come off really, really black. So you're going to want to make sure that you're being really, really light with it. You don't need to push heavily. I'm actually going to cut this down a little bit to fit our paper here. I'm going to be a little bit, I'm just going to eyeball it. See if that actually translates. Oh, yes, I can see it. Great. Okay. I'm going to use my good old-fashioned scissors here and cut it. I'm just cutting the carbon paper out because I want it to fit a little bit more accurately. And just not have this big sheet of floppy carbon paper around because that'll annoy me. And it might annoy you, so it'll be a good little trick here. Like I said, I'm not making this thing exact. This is not a perfect cut by any means. But I'm not going to be grading you on your craft here on this particular area, because your craft doesn't really matter here. All right, now what we're going to do is the same thing that we have done with our previous uses of carbon paper. We're going to tape the front of the carbon paper, and we're just going to kind of fold tape back, front and back. So we've got a nice little folded area to make sure that our carbon paper doesn't move when we're making our drawing, because that would be a total nightmare. And I'm just going to cut off a couple more pieces of tape. Put some on my tripod legs here. My dog's headed over to the water bowl, so you all have been warned. I think that's pretty good. We've got it on 4 corners. I'm feeling pretty happy about it. We do have a little area that's kind of overflapping or overlayering, so I'm just going to make sure that's kind of pressed down and wrapping around the form pretty nice and securely. just by pulling that paper back. Actually, you know what? Just to make sure, I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more there just so that doesn't pop up. All right, so my carbon paper is fully covering the entire 6x6 motif paper that I'm going to be creating and transferring my larger sketch to. So what I'm going to do now is center this to where I want it to be located. I'm just going to look once again at my positive and negative space. I can't totally remember how I had the orientation. It looked a little like this. Or was it like this? Nope, I like this way more. And like I said to you, this could just be you just kind of playing around with it some. I'm going to once again look at my positive and negative spaces, see how this is butting up. This looks pretty good. All right, I'm looking at my end of my wing over here and just butting it up to my corner, making sure it's equal distance to my almond over here. And then I'm going to look at my bottom of my stick and the top of that little flower in the back, and I might need to just move this down a hair. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape it. Ooh, I have to move it back over a little bit. I'm just going to tape it down. So I'm taping the transfer paper drawing down onto my carbon transfer paper, okay? Tracing paper and transfer paper. God, we're really working with our language today, huh? All right, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pen, or if you have a 2H pencil, or a mechanical pencil like my blue mechanical pencil here, just simply go over and trace over your area. Now, it might be really important during this stage for you to have an area of the drawing or the transfer paper that you can easily untape to kind of look at and kind of check in to see where maybe you have traced or maybe where you've forgotten some lines. So just be cognizant of the fact that you might have to kind of go back and look at your drawing when you're doing this. Normally when I am doing any kind of tracing, and just to kind of like as a nice checks and balance system, I kind of work from top left to bottom right. That's also just like a drawing practice that I've established for myself because I'm right-handed, and I've gotten into the habit of just doing that because I don't want to mess my shading up. So I'm going to go ahead and actually start on my little bee over here. I'm using a 2H pencil, and essentially I am just going to go ahead and really carve out the spaces of this little bee. I'm going to go ahead and switch to a time-lapse section of the video, and I'm going to go ahead and complete this drawing from this point on with a little time-lapse. Okay, so some good pointers when working on this, and I know I mentioned this before, but this is just a good reminder. Make sure that your transfer paper composition is fully taped down to the black carbon transfer paper. On the black carbon transfer paper, make sure that you are taping down and securing it to the back of your Bristol board or watercolor paper, and then go back and forth between lifting the carbon paper up and checking where your drawing is located, just to make sure everything is transferring fine and well and you don't miss anything when you're drawing. As you can see, I'm doing this multiple times, and it's really helping my overall composition and making sure that I'm not missing anything in my transfer process. Always make sure to draw light when you're working with a 2H pencil because that black carbon paper is going to transfer really heavily. All right, so I have my kind of finished, transferred, copied image over here on my mosaic. So remember, I just essentially took this and just copied all of this information directly onto my paper from my carbon paper and my tracing paper sketches. So I did all of this. Now I am at the this particular part of the video where I am going to break down how we actually continue and make our mosaic. So I've got some written instructions here for you on our project sheet. I'm just going to switch over there too. So essentially the making of the motif instructions. This whole entire area I'm going to essentially walk you through. I have written instructions for you to look at, so please feel free to go back to your project sheet and look at them. But I'm going to walk you through essentially that part of your assignment sheet. So there is written instructions, and there's also going to be this visual to help you with this. The reason I'm emphasizing the point that there are written instructions and we're going to do this together on this video is because this is a little bit tricky. So feel free to always stop, pause, or rewatch the video as many times as you need to really understand this particular part of the process. I know there's going to be many of you that have questions. It's not as complicated as it may seem, but it will take some practice. What I'm going to do to complete my motif is I'm actually going to flip it over to the back side. I've got a 6x6 image. I've kind of wrote that on the back here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to define the division point between both the left side, top and bottom side of my image. So essentially I'm going to, I've already got a line here actually dividing this in the center. Since I know this is a 6x6 image, I'm essentially just going to divide it. So that's going to give me 3. I'm going to put a tick at the top, tick at the bottom, and then just draw a line straight down the center. Now I'm going to rinse and repeat that process on the other side. So I'm going to measure. I'm going to find the middle point, which is going to be 3. I'm going to put a tick there and put a tick here down at the bottom. And I'll draw a line right down the center. Now, as I mentioned, this is a little bit complicated, so you need to pay attention here. And if you need to rewatch this, please rewatch this. It's going to make more sense for you to rewatch the video, so please make sure that you need to do this step accurately, okay? All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to first divide this, okay? So I'm going to actually just cut straight down the center. Remember, you always want to cut on the back side. All right, and I'm going to find my X-Acto knife, which has disappeared. That's always great. Probably in my mess of papers off screen. Yes, that's exactly where it was. All right, and I'm actually just going to cut this straight down the center. Okay, now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to lift my ruler off, okay? So this goes together like that, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my left image, I'm going to push that out, and then what I'm going to do is just lift it up and then drag it over, okay? So what I am doing right now is I'm essentially having my center of my drawing, which is now going to be on the outside, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put a nice bead of tape right down the center, making this as flush as possible. And if it's overlapping, then let's go ahead and fix it. I'm going to actually use a little bit smaller tape to help me correct this to begin with. Now our sketch, our motif sketch, is going to be a little bit on the rougher side. So that's why when we transfer this over to our larger pattern, it'll be nice and clean and we'll have good craft there. All right, so as you can see, if I flip this back over, now both sides of my sketches are on the outside, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it so it's vertically on its side, right? Drawing side's vertical. All right, so I'm just going to essentially rotate this counterclockwise, and then I'm going to cut in that center line. Now, since my center line got a little bit screwed up, it looks like I'm going to just remeasure this and start it at 3. I don't know how that got screwed up, but it did. Maybe it wasn't perfectly straight to begin with, so maybe that's on me. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just mark this. Oh, it is a little off. Look at that. User error. Okay, all right, and then over here a little bit. That was total user error, guys. All right. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut this side. Straight down the center, just lining that line up, making sure it's perfectly parallel, flush, and then I'm going to cut straight down the center. All right. So what I'm going to do now Okay, so I just did that really quickly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to essentially do the same thing that I did last time. I'm going to lift my left side up and then just transfer it over to the right side, okay? Then I'm going to line those points up and then tape it down. So make sure, once again, that this is completely flush, meaning that the 2 points of these papers are meeting completely center, all right? So I don't want to see any overlap of any paper. I don't want your paper looking like this when you tape it down, right? Like I don't want to see any big gaps, even a little tiny gap like that. I don't want to see, all right? I want this to be completely flush on all 4 sides of where you cut. All right, so I've got some basic tape here. And then I'm going to tape down the center piece so it's a little bit stronger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out more of my tape here. Cut it in half, and then go over that midpoint just so it's a little bit stronger. I'm going to go pretty much up to the line here. Grab a little bit more tape on the side that I have left over. Go straight up to that line. Okay. Then I'm going to flip it over. Now this is what your pattern should look like, all right? You should have a complete center drawing that is now on the 4 corners of your page. Now you're going to have all of this internal space, okay? So what we're going to do from this point is we're going to add more content to the outside. Now what we can do is we can go back in and add more flowers if we want to on top, right? I've got some more flowers over here that we could add. Like these particular little fellows. I can add those in to the center, or I could add more bees. In my particular case, I'm going to actually add some mites in, and I might add these flowers. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add these kind of little mites in. I'm going to speed our drawing up through the design process. I'm going to add some mites on the side as well as finish the center piece of my tiles. Of course, the design process I've kind of organically walked you through my problem solving and decision making skills. This is of course a trial and error process. Figure out what you like, figure out what makes the composition work best, and go from there. There we go. All right, so I'm liking the way this looks. All right, so now I have my full motif sketch. It's all worked out. What I would do at this point is I would essentially take a picture on a nice clean white background of this particular work, so you have a copy of it to turn in for me for your project. Remember, I am going to want to count this as a sketch, and I am going to see your mosaic tile before you turn it in for your final project. So go ahead and take a quick picture of this, and then you can go on and move on to step 3 after this is all done. Okay, let's go ahead and switch gears. Let's talk about the sketching process if you're going to freehand or free draw it. Of course, you can go back and forth and use some of your tracing method that I just showed you and just demonstrated, and kind of work in tandemly with both drawing and then transferring some of those kind of traced images from your tracing paper onto your motif square or rectangle, whatever you're working from. So if we're going to, just kind of hand draw it, this is a little bit more open. Obviously, you're going to start it pretty similar to maybe how you would with your tracing. You're going to start figuring about general placement of things, how you're going to want your forms to kind of work around. I'm going to go ahead and just do some tracing or some drawing, excuse me, not tracing. So I'm going to go ahead and do a time-lapse section here. So I'm going to speed this up so you could just watch me through the drawing process and kind of watch me as I go along with my second sketch here. So go ahead and enjoy. So the design process for me really starts with kind of thinking about my center objects in the center of the page. So I'm really thinking about scaling and the size of my objects and the forms that I'm working with. I also wanted to include line activation that's going to kind of sweep across diagonally both top left to bottom right corners of my image. So I wanted a lot of activation, a lot of speed, and a lot of motion in my work. So I've added some kind of tree branches including those flowers and both the almonds. Now I'm incorporating bees at both the top and the left bottom side of my image to kind of incorporate that theme of the relationship of the bee to the agriculture of the almond production in California or in North America. I'm going back and forth and really creating not only small forms but medium to large forms to create an all-over, well-designed and well-thematic themed image. At this point, I have a fully completed motif drawing. As you can see, all of my major content is in the center of my image. From this point, I'm going to finish my motif by demonstrating my motif cutting method. I'm going to go ahead and divide my 6x6 image, and of course, I'm going to put a little tick at the top and bottom of my page, dividing the page completely in half by 3. I'm going to take my left image and simply flip it over to the other side, making my left image over on the right side and my right side of the image over on the left side. Then I'm going to turn my drawing counterclockwise, then make a tick at the 3 point at top and bottom points of the image, connect that with the ruler, and then cut down the center again. Then I'm going to take my left image and put it over on my right side, moving my right side of the image over to the left side. Then I'm going to put a piece of paper into the center points, making sure that they're both parallel on top and bottom points of the image, and that I have a fully completed 6x6 image that is connected with tape. Now, as you'll notice, my drawing that was in the center is now operating on all 4 corners of the page. So that means I have a center of the page which is completely kind of dead space. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this information up. I'm going to start sketching, and I kind of have a stroke of insight or kind of inspiration here as I'm working through some of these images. I start kind of thinking about how I want to make this design and how I want this to really connect and be incorporated with my almond farm. And I actually thought about it from a larger perspective. And this once again gets into that designing idea about how we can start thinking about scaling and proportion, and of course form dictates content. I draw a center kind of circle here to kind of have a nice sense of balance as well as a scale difference. I want this to be a really kind of large point in my overall pattern that maybe starts to unify the piece and also kind of creates a contrast form. If you remember, that center point really has a lot of dynamic kind of X shapes with the flowers and those tree branches crossing, and I thought that nice circled form would create some really nice visual contrast. What I'm doing in the center now is I'm drawing a flower, and I'm really not liking the way this is looking, so I decide to erase it and then once again start to pull on my visual research that I was doing all the way back in step 1, and I actually decide to go with a very different type of image. What I did here is I start to draw a large perspective, a far out perspective, I guess you can say, of a almond farm. So I find a picture in California that I really like of an almond farm, and I start drawing the mountains in the background, the kind of valleys, a little bit of light shading that's happening there, and then the large almond fields with trees and the cast shadow of the trees on the ground. So this is actually a good way to start thinking about how you're going to start incorporating different elements of your drawing, how you can start to unite them, and also be creative in your approaches with this project. You don't necessarily just have to draw the specimen. You can draw and incorporate the ecosystem or environment or habitat that the specimen is affecting or a part of. So be creative here, really cycle through images, and this is once again where step 1 is going to be so vital for creating a successful design, and that's pulling back on your visual research and being inspired by some of this content and some of the information that you're seeing. Now, as you can see, I'm doing these little tiny mites scattered throughout the image. This is not only going to create a really interesting kind of image, but it's also going to shove home the point that these mites are infesting this area, and it's really causing massive collapse in the bee colonies. So I'm having them scattered throughout the entire background of the space, showing their kind of omnipresence in this environment. So as you can see, I've got my 2 images here, my design on the right being my first and my design on the left being my second attempt. So as you can see the difference, and there you go. Let's go ahead and dive into step 3. In step 3, we're going to be developing our final patterned project. So essentially what we'll be doing is taking our mosaic tile that we developed, or our motif tile that we developed in step 2, and then essentially be repeating that on our larger image. Of course, we're going to have to cut down Bristol board, mixed media paper, or our watercolor paper, just depending upon the medium that you're working. If you are working with watercolor, I would highly recommend making a little white border for your tape to sit on so you can secure it to a board so there's no rippling. My particular example, I'll be mostly working with a little bit of washes and mostly watercolor, so I did not include a board on my final image, but if you are working with watercolor, I would highly recommend putting a 1" or 1/4 border on both the top, right, bottom, and left side of the image. All right, so that's going to be really, really helpful for crafting. Essentially, this is a nice breakdown talking about what you need to do to complete this assignment. So this is all written out for you in your creating the final project instruction section. So it's 1 through 5 steps here. Please follow along and make sure that you are following all of this guidelines to make sure that you have a successful project and you can also stay on track. All right, so if you are feeling a little apprehensive about the drawing process, I did give you that first option of using a transfer paper. So you can find transfer paper in our 2D drawing studios. Of course, all of the requisite information is listed in our project sheet. If you do not feel comfortable going to studio or going to campus, you can also buy it from an online distributor or any good crafting or art store in your local area. It's pretty cheap and affordable material, anywhere from like $3 to $9 with tax. So feel free to get it shipped or go buy it if you would prefer that method. All right, let's go ahead and switch over to our video and I'll demonstrate how to complete our third and final step for this project. All right, so on our screen, we have our 2 example sketches, and this is going to turn our attention to something really important for this particular process and just art processes in general. It's really important to sketch out your thoughts for all of your assignments that you'll do in this class or for other classes. And the reason being is because often you'll find your first sketch isn't as good as your second. Now, I drew the second one by hand, and I just got kind of inspired because I noticed this one was a little bit dull and it just wasn't doing quite the things that I wanted to do. It also wasn't scaling the right types of ways. So I mean, they were all kind of the same kind of similar size. And so I wanted some larger components, some smaller components, and then some medium-sized components. So this one has some really great scale difference, some good change. It's got a lot of variety and diversity in terms of forms and marks that are in the actual work, as well as it's got some really unique features to it. So I really like how the space is developed in this left image, and this is the one that I'm going to ultimately decide on making my larger project for. Make sure to document both images and turn them in on your blog, so you can have them for turn in for me. So our assignment is going to now then take this motif, and then we're going to duplicate this 4 times on our paper, whether that be vellum or a watercolor paper, and then we're going to transfer this image, making our larger final completed whole pattern. So as I said, I'm going to be making a 12 by 12 image or final pattern, and I have designed a 6 by 6 motif to work off of. So theoretically, this is going to transfer perfectly 4 times, right? So I'm going to go ahead and cut down the paper now. You're, of course, going to need a mat board, some cutting utensils, and all that good stuff. And just make sure your blade's nice and sharp, and make sure your cutting is on point. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'm going to speed the video up a little bit through that process. My design will be made mostly with color pencil. I'll be doing some light washes, maybe with gouache, but it will be primarily a color pencil drawing. So I'm actually going to be using vellum. This is another warning: if you will be using a watercolor or gouache materials or any wet materials, make sure to leave some extra space or add some extra borders to your end image so you can have enough room to tape down your paper to a board so you can work successfully with good craft. Now that I have my paper cut out, I am going to go ahead and start with my transfer process. Essentially what we are going to be doing is really thinking about how our tile or our motif tile is going to be fitting into these spaces. So this is a 6 by 6 image. We are working on a 12 by 12 large piece of paper, and we're going to take that 6 by 6 and then just move it down accordingly. So as you saw, just with what I did, it's going to be an equal proportion and measurement, creating that kind of outside image and really putting it on the inside. So that original sketch is going to be on the center of the drawing. All right, so let's go ahead and show you some demonstration for this. You're going to need your carbon or graphite tracing paper and a good H2 pencil that is sharp.
All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to grab those pieces of beautiful transfer paper that we have. I still have 2 more left over, so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of max them out. Essentially what I'm going to do is I have 2 pieces. I think they are 9 by 13. So I'm actually going to have to tape mine together to make them fully fit my 12 by 12 image. So I'm going to just take those 2 sheets, and I'm going to move my image out of the way. And remember, if you're working with this tracing paper, this stuff is really, really dark. So you don't need to apply a lot of pressure to transfer anything. In fact, you're going to want to work really, really lightly, which that's actually going to be pretty nice too for your hands and give your wrist a break and not put a lot of tension or anything on your wrist. So that'll be some good plus things that we'll have from this. I'm going to go ahead, and what I'm doing right now is I'm just matching up the seams, and I'm going to tape them together. So I'm just going to essentially make a really big sheet. Now I've got, like I said, a roll of this that I could use, but since you guys are working from these smaller sheets, I thought I'd just demonstrate how to do this real quickly. So that way it's like a one-to-one comparison, and that way you'll know what to do. And as you can see what I just did there, I'm kind of like holding it down and then like pulling it down together, so then I get a nice kind of simple sheet. I'm actually going to do connect them from the top, bottom, center point, and then I'm going to do 2 pieces of tape in between. This is just going to secure that I'm getting a really nice kind of even sheet of tissue paper or tracing paper. It is tissue paper. What am I talking about? It's not like I'm wrong. All right, let's go ahead and use our board now. So I'm going to take my 12 by 12 page, and I'm just going to see where this thing starts to fit. As I mentioned, this should be around 9 by 12, 9 by 13. I think that's at least what it is. That makes sense because this is 12 and I've got about an inch over. It might be a little under 13. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut this to fit my 12 by 12 page. The reason I'm going to do that is just going to help with craft. So I'm going to measure out with my ruler here 12 inches. So I'm going to put my ruler at 0. And I'm actually going to do this off my page because, as you can see, all that information, it transfers really quickly, even just with your fingernails. So I'm going to go ahead and just put my ruler down here. Just make sure to clean off my cutting mat after I'm done. All right. Gonna put a 12 there. And I'm gonna put 12 over here. And when you're measuring this out, you want to make sure that you're putting this right up to 0, and remember, you're keeping this parallel from the edge of your ruler to the edge of your carbon paper. And I'm just going to go ahead and watch what I'm doing. I'm holding it on my ruler, but I'm taking my hand and I'm just pushing that paper, so I'm getting it really flush. And the weight of the ruler should give you a pretty good, secure kind of fit. Okay, then I'm going to switch rulers, and I'm going to get a much larger ruler. Kind of flip this around so I can see my measurements. This is going to be pretty light since it's drawn with graphite and it's on a black page, so it's probably not registering on your view of the camera, but I can see it perfectly well, and as long as I can see it, then we're all groovy. All right, so I'm going to double check this, make sure this looks good. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut this. Oops. This is not the ideal way for me to cut, so this is probably not going to be super accurate. So make sure you are in a comfortable cutting position as well. And I'm also going to now measure out 12 inches horizontally. Oh, I've got a fold over here. Maybe I'll do it the other way. See if I can straighten it out. Okay, that's fine. All right, now I'm going to take my 12 inches and measure out 12 over here. I'm going to draw it a little bit heavy so I can see it. You can also, if you're having a hard time seeing it, you can use white color pencil. And that'll show up pretty fine on this paper. Double check my measurement. Good. Let's put it at 12 here. And then once again, I'm going to cut on those lines. I'm going to take my, oops. I've got a very tight little filming setup right now, so you're probably going to see my head. Sorry about that. And I can't find my mark, so that's a good sign for us. That looks totally wrong. So is that? I don't know if that's totally wrong. Let's double check it. Cutting tissue paper is not fun. Or tracing paper, excuse me. I keep calling it tissue paper. It is tissue paper, but you guys know what I mean. Hopefully when I'm saying that. Cool, and I just bumped the camera. So hopefully we don't have a really crazy view. Maybe I'll edit this out later. We'll see. All right, I'm going to go ahead and gut this. Very tight coordinates, or quarters, in my filming studio area right now. Okay. Let's go ahead and see what's going on. Okay. Oh, looks like I didn't bump the camera too bad. Good. All right. So now I should have a 12 by 12 image. Hopefully this is 12 by 12. Otherwise, I think this is my last piece of tracing paper. So let's hope I don't have to go back and buy some on my wonderful teacher's budget. Oh God, I think I messed up. I totally messed up. Great. All right, so this is why you always measure twice and cut once. So, all right, well, a blooper is always good to have in a demo, so we're going to keep this. All right, I'm going to try to go ahead and erase some of this. Now, as I mentioned, our graphite or our carbon paper is really sensitive to any types of pressure that you will apply. So you want to be really careful when you're making your transfer, really accurate with your mark, and make sure that there's not extra things going on around your studio, so you'll have a nice clean transfer area. All right, so I'm gonna have a little bit of a hiccup over here because I didn't get this quite right. So that's not gonna be a huge deal. I'll just tape more down at the bottom. So if that does happen to you, you can just do that too, since I did have a heck of a time. Trying to figure out which way to be best to do this. Wish I would have cut it on this end and made the bad measurement. That would have been really nice. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to attach my carbon paper. I'm just going to take some tape off and make some little tabs like this. And I'm just going to essentially fold it over the corners. So in case I need to lift up one side to see where I'm sketching and making sure that my drawing's accurate, I can do that. I'm going to just put it directly on top of the carbon paper, make sure my corners are directly lining up with that space. So this gets a 100% correct on the money. All right, and then I'm going to do the same thing over on the left side. Smooth that paper out. It might be a good idea if you're having some issues cutting this, like I clearly did, you might want to just cut a little bit larger, so that way you won't have run into any issues. Clearly, because I had a problem cutting this. All right. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. Transfer that over. And I'm just going to take this piece. Just going to take a little tiny sliver off and connect it. like my blade's getting dull, so that's probably why I'm not doing a great job cutting. So this is a good tip. You feel like your blade is getting dull, go ahead. I also think this wax paper, or the material on this is really, really slippery. All good crafting tips. I feel like there needs to be kind of like a Bob Ross expression going on right now. Just go flow with the man. Just go with the flow. Things happen. All right. All right, so I'm just going to be really careful of this space, really cognizant of the space. All right, and there we go. So I'll have one side that I can lift up and do some stuff with. Now, as I mentioned, this is just a reminder, quick tips and reminders about how to use your carbon paper. When using your carbon paper, you always want to make sure that the waxy or kind of glossy looking side, the side that has a lot of material and has that kind of waxy finish, that's going to be the transferring side, right? So that's what's going to put actually the material of the carbon onto the page. So that side always needs to be that kind of facing down on the page. Your kind of duller matte side, which is going to be kind of speckled, and like I said, it's going to be a little bit more matte in comparison and probably just less saturated. It's not going to be that strong black. That's going to be on top, all right? So that's going to be your general rule here. All right, so what we're going to do for this particular project is we're going to essentially start, I'm going to just start on the left-hand side, and I'm going to just trace over my first image, or this first quadrant over here. Like I said, we will be creating essentially 4 different drawings, or we're going to be, I guess, stamping this 4 different times. So 1, 2, 3, 4. You're just going to want to make sure that you're paying attention in the order, and don't go, just making sure you're looking at your drawing and kind of going back and forth. It's going to be really important to kind of look at that. All right, as we go along here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially tape some of this down. I'm going to take my tape up here, and I'm going to butt this right up to the edge of my paper. And I'm just going to essentially fold it over. Same here. I'm going to fold it right over. So that way I can have a really nice, clear, definitive mark. I'm actually going to take some white colored pencil, and I'm actually just going to outline where the edge of this is. I'm going to draw really lightly. This is just going to give me a good indication about where I need to butt up my square in the future. So when I go to move it, and draw on the other side, draw down here and draw down here, I'll have some lines kind of mapped out to give me a general kind of comparison about where I need to butt those things up to. Of course, I'm just going to always sync it up to my corners, but that'll also kind of just help me out. And of course, the more guidance you have and more guidelines you have, the better off you're going to be for just general drawing practices. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 2H pencil, and this is what I'm going to draw with. Make sure it's nice and pointy. So go ahead, and I would sharpen each time you finish a drawing. Go ahead and sharpen it for the next quadrant, next quadrant, next quadrant. So make sure you have a sharpener handy and all that good stuff. Now you can simply put on some music, listen to an audiobook, or watch a movie in the background while you transfer your image. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video just to kind of show you the time lapse of me completing this whole entire drawing. Feel free to watch me as I go along, and make sure that you are just being aware of what you're transferring. If you need to pick up the drawing and pick up the transfer paper, just make sure that you go back and retape it back down. Okay? So let's go ahead and start our drawing.
In total, this drawing took about an hour to complete, so pace your time and just make sure you have something going on in the background that you can listen to or enjoy watching and listening simultaneously. So what I'm doing, I'm just being really mindful of my tracing. I'm making sure that my image, my motif image that I'm working from, is taped down to my carbon transfer paper. That's going to be the most critical part. Make sure that your carbon transfer paper is also secured to your background drawing paper that you're transferring onto. What I'm also doing too, which is really helpful for me, I'm constantly lifting up my transfer paper to make sure that it's transferring accurately. It's also going to be really important when you're shifting tiles to make sure that your tiles are actually meeting where they're supposed to. Now, I did a really good job measuring with mine, so it is perfectly 6 by 6 around, and my image is perfectly 12 by 12, so it fits together really well. But still, an accident could happen or occur, so you want to make sure that you're making little marks maybe on the actual carbon transfer paper with a white color pencil to indicate a kind of key setting, or you're also looking back at your drawing that you're transferring onto your paper to make sure that all of those lines are syncing up properly. I'm actually going into sometimes and just correcting the marks with my pencil. So you can see me doing that on the time-lapse video segment of the video that you're watching. So just be aware of that and be really diligent and constantly looking at how those corners, especially those corners that are connecting in the center, are meeting up and meeting their kind of mated marks on the other side. Also, for other helpful tips, make sure that you are not pushing too hard, especially if you're working with a harder leaded pencil like a 2H pencil. Remember, H stands for hardness, so that is a harder lead pencil. It's got more of a clay in its body of the lead material, so it's going to be a pretty heavy mark. You don't want to be applying too much pressure because otherwise you'll be transferring a really black mark. I am applying a heavier pressure primarily for the video to pick up the marks, and so that it'll be really well to translate and you can see it well on the frames. But I would not be drawing as dark as I am actually drawing. So this is going to get us to our end of the drawing, and I will show you the final product and the ending or the completion of this image. So I'm going to go ahead and pull off the transfer paper and I'm going to reveal the final image. Now there might be some small corrections that you need to make, just kind of syncing up those lines or making that transition a little bit more smooth, or there might be some little mistakes where you perhaps grazed your knuckle or fingers across the carbon paper and it transferred a little bit of marks. So I'm going to go in and just clean up some of those dirty scuff marks and outline those lines so they're a little bit clearer in the center. Like I said, this is going to be absolutely critical when you're transferring your motif onto your main page, that you're really being mindful of those connection points, especially when it comes to the center of your drawing. Like I said, I did a pretty good job measuring and I was really mindful of making sure that my image was lining up every time that I went to go transfer, so I didn't have too many mistakes. So let's go ahead and dive into coloring the image and moving on to completing and colorizing the work. All right, so we are at the final end kind of stages of step 3 and completing our finished work, our final pattern that was transferred. I'm going to work on a smaller image just because primarily I don't have enough room to really work on my larger example image here. But so I made a smaller little trace down here so I can demonstrate some basic gouache techniques or color pencil techniques. We've worked pretty intensely with both gouache paint and color pencil at this point, so you should have a pretty good working knowledge of how these materials work and function. We've both worked with the gouache pretty opaquely thus far. For this particular assignment, you can go ahead and start working a little bit more transparently with it and do washes. And of course, it will react just like watercolor will. It'll be nice and transparent while still maintaining a lot of high pigment integrity. You can also combine color pencil and gouache, or even watercolor if you have watercolors that you want to work with for this particular section of the project. So I'm going to be both demonstrating a little bit of combination between gouache and color pencils and some different techniques that you can use in tandem for this project. If you want to complete this all in color pencil, that's totally fine. If you want to complete this all in gouache, that's totally fine. If you want to combine them or mix them together, that's also completely okay. So I just want you to make a really nice, well-developed image, an image that is successful and is interesting to look at, right? All right, so we're going to go ahead and maybe start with a little example over here. I've also got a little piece of white paper that I'll be doing both some color pencil techniques and other kind of things, just some tests that I can show you how they might operate on a blank page. Okay, so for any type of gouache, right, we're always going to need some water, paper towels, a palette, and of course our image to be fully taped down with a painter's safe paper tape, such as painter's tape or a delicate paper tape, as well as a variety of different brushes. As I mentioned multiple times throughout the video and just in the assignment, if you are going to be working with a wet media such as gouache or watercolor, you will need to make sure that your image is secured down onto a mat board with painter's tape. So that's going to require you to add about a 1/4 inch border to both the top, bottom, left, and right side of your image. So when you're going to transfer and you're making the transfer process from your motif to your larger final patterned project, this might be a little bit trickier because maybe you just have to leave or allocate a little bit of space or border for that 1/4 border on the top, bottom, left, and right of the image. Okay, so just be careful, be mindful, and make sure that you are allocating enough space to handle those materials and mediums. Okay, you've been thoroughly warned at this point. You should know and understand. If you have questions about this, always feel free to reach out for me. But just be aware that you will need to have enough space for your painter's tape to secure your image down onto a board. All right, so we're going to go ahead and talk about this image. I've drawn pretty dark on this example as well. Remember, if you are using carbon paper, this stuff does not really erase that well. The reason I am drawing so dark in my videos is primarily just so that it registers on the video. Because there is some white balance issues when I go to film these projects. So please make sure that you're not drawing too heavily or not applying too much pressure with your actual pencil or pen that you're working with to transfer the image. You just want a light little mark. So if you have washes or lighter color pencils or paints that you're applying, it's not going to be totally grossed out by that really dark mark that's going to appear right next to it. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just talk about some simple applications of color, working with gouache a little bit more transparently. This is going to be a little bit more intuitive. So essentially, you're just going to pull out some paint, and I'm just going to be a little bit more quick with this demo since this demo is so long. But I'm just going to be mixing this together with my brush and kind of working with it a little bit more like watercolor. And so what I mean by that is I'm adding a decent amount of water to the actual pigment and creating a really nice light wash. So this is always really important to talk about good crafting tips. Before painting our image, you always want to make sure you have an extra scrap piece of paper just to figure out how that color is going to look. And if that's the color that you want, then you can go ahead and paint. If that's not, then you can go ahead and adjust that color according to how you want it to look. All right. This not only is in terms of the hue of the color, but it's also the transparency of the color. If you're working with opaque paint such as gouache and you start adding more water to it, maybe you want it even lighter than this, then that's when you start playing around with just dragging more water onto the side and creating a lighter wash kind of color. If you do want it more saturated, just work a little bit more opaque with it. You know the deal by now, and you should get a good feel for how this works. All right, so once we have a good decision for that and we've come to a good process, I'm going to go ahead and start painting in my forms. You're going to want to just really outline your background. The way I would start this project is maybe outline my background first and then go in towards my main subject matter. It doesn't really necessarily matter just as long as you're staying consistent. I am going to introduce maybe 2 different types of painting techniques for you.
And thus far we have worked with gouache really opaquely. So what that means primarily is that we're working just straight up with the gouache. We're not applying a lot of water. We've added a little bit of water to kind of change the viscosity of the gouache paint so it's a little bit more fluid when we work with it. But we really haven't been working too transparent with the actual material thus far. So this is where we're going to introduce two terms. We're going to introduce painting terms such as working with wet on wet and wet on dry. So what I am doing right now, this technique that I am working with is a wet on dry technique. So what that means is I am taking a wet material such as my paint and I am applying it to a dry surface. All right, so this is a wet on dry technique. Usually this creates a really nice kind of graphic, kind of clean mark and image, really consistent usually in the background. There's not a whole lot of mark cultivation or generation that you can get from this. You usually have to wait till it dries and then layer over it to get a lot of kind of marks or blending techniques. But usually this creates a really nice kind of decent solid color. All right, the second kind of technique is called a wet on dry technique. I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate that now. Essentially, you're going to take a clean brush, you're going to thoroughly wet it with clean wet water. Wet water, yeah, that's right. I'm getting tired. All right, so we're going to take our brush and put it in our wet water, and we're going to go ahead and wet an area of our particular image. So this is called a wet on wet technique because we are working with a wet surface and wet material. So I'm going to go ahead and just outline this area, and I'm going to show you the difference with result that you can have with just different applications of these two techniques. All right, so this area is now thoroughly saturated with water. I'm going to go ahead and load my brush up with material, just simply covering it thoroughly with the pigment over here, and I'm going to start putting this material in. As you can see already, this reacts very differently than our wet on dry technique. As you can tell, there's a quality difference, there's a surface difference. Not that one's good, bad, or otherwise, they just do different things. You can get kind of nice washes with this. You can also get kind of really nice bleeded or bled kind of areas where your pigment is starting to bleed into the water, and it does some really interesting mixing on the surface. So you can play around with these two techniques in tandem. You can really start to have fun with how you're kind of generating marks, generating color, as well as information in your image just with these two basic painting techniques. All right. In addition to that, you can also use kind of blotting methods to work with your color paint. So what we're going to go do is I'm going to actually just add a big area of color over here and add some more material to it. This is just a wet on dry kind of technique that I'm doing. And I'm going to demonstrate some blotting. And what I mean by blotting is taking my paper towel and kind of taking an area up of paint. And so this is going to do a couple of different things. It's going to create some interesting surface texture and tension on the actual work. But it's also going to remove paint. So this is a good kind of way to erase or create texture in your work. So what I'm going to do is just take my paper towel and just lift that material up. So you can see you'll get some really nice tonal differences. You can actually create a really sophisticated little drawing and painting here just by creating different blotted sections. Of course, you can go back over and rework this area if you would like, adding more material back in on top of it. Just to create different kind of nuance. If you don't like that, then of course you can blot that up and lift it up, and you can see how much material you actually are left with. So it does actually erase and lift up a lot of paint and material. You can also go back into an area of your work, and let's say you want to outline this little mite in a dark green. You can go back over and cancel out that carbon kind of mark with a nice green mark. So this is just another area where you can start to think about unity in your work, unifying your color, and also creating a really nice little detail with your paint. And this could be just a really beautiful little section where you start to add little bits of detail, little bits of stylistic characteristic, and once again, that detail will just take your work into the next level. All right, so these are two techniques for painting. We've also demonstrated another technique for blotting that can generate different types of marks and different quality of marks. So you can really have fun and start to play with this area. In addition to that, we can also start thinking about the type of mixed media that we want to do. And so what I'm going to demonstrate now is I'm going to take just a little bit of blue, and I'm going to go get some white real quick. Thought I had some, but I guess I did not. I'm going to mix some of our white in with our blue, just to give me a little bit lighter kind of blue here to start with. And then I'm going to actually make my background color. So I've got this nice kind of California sky. Let's say if I want to make this daytime, like afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock. This blue is going to be perfect for 2 o'clock skies. So this is another area in color theory where you're going to have to start thinking about color application and time of day. You might want to tone your colors just based upon the day in which you're working or the time that you're working to match the natural color setting that the sun is producing. I'm going to go ahead and just paint this area really quickly. Once again, I'm doing a wet on dry just because that's a little bit quicker for me right now. But either method, a wet on dry or a wet on wet, would work perfectly fine for this. And I'm going to just blend this in nice and well here. And I'm going to actually just let this area dry for a little bit. And the reason I'm going to let it dry is because I'm going to go back over it with color pencil a little bit later. I'm going to actually take my color or my paper towel and just blot up some areas here, just a little bit, creating kind of texture. This can kind of simulate maybe some sky or cloud space. I could even go back in, and remember this is gouache, so it actually can rehydrate, and I can lift up more material, right? So you just saw what I was able to do there, and how much material I was actually able to lift up. And that's the really cool thing about gouache. It's very similar to watercolor. It's basically just an opaque version of watercolor, so you can really lift up a lot of material. So as you can see, that blotting effect, when used with mixing it with water, can actually generate and cultivate some very interesting marks. So I'm going to just let this dry for a few minutes, and then I'll go back over with our color pencil. Let's go ahead while that dries and kind of switch the topic again and talk about different types of colors pencils with some of these marks. So let's say if we want to start combining some of our color pencil forms together, maybe we can start by simply outlining forms. So as I mentioned, we've got some gouache backgrounds here, but maybe we want to start filling in these mites also too with some color. So we can actually outline them with color pencil and creating a really sharp mark. This might also be really effective too. Let's say if you do draw really heavy with your carbon paper, you can go over it with a colored pencil or a darker color colored pencil, or even pen if you wanted to too in some cases, and outline some of those forms to give us some color back. So those mites were kind of like a really gross rusty orange color, so I'm going to actually have to layer that color a little bit just to get me to that right form. So I'm going to go over and create a base layer of a nice yellow tone in those marks. And of course, go back over it with a little bit of red. And you guys at this point really love color pencils, so you know exactly what I'm doing here. Layering those marks, layering those forms, and cultivating a really nice developed image here. Oh, and look how saturated those boys are, those little mites. All right, so as you can see, they can work really well together. You can start playing, of course, with manipulating that color even further. You can start to change the value of it to give it even some highlighted areas, give it a directional sunlight or kind of directional lighting. That could also be another kind of area of nuance and detail that you start adding to your work just to make it pop even a little bit further. All right, so of course, you know how to work with color pencil at this point, really well blending and incorporating those colors. And thinking about, too, all this different blending techniques, not only in terms of layering the color pencil, but burnishing as well. If you want to work lighter with your color pencil in this project, you can also have the freedom and liberty to do that. So I'm simply, maybe you want to just have some kind of lighter marks, meaning that you have a couple of layers of color pencil, but you don't actually burnish the color pencil. So I'm just going to go through here and give you some examples. So I'm just simply kind of drawing in our form or our background with this nice green. And maybe I'll layer it a couple of areas, but maybe I won't burnish it. Then I can go back in and make some color decisions for those mites with my color pencils. And I can also just layer and blend lightly with my color pencil, but not burnish. That's also something that you can start to play with stylistically, how you're going to colorize your image, how you're going to work with your materials to give you the best cultivated image for crafting your medium, or meaning, excuse me. So once again, think about that concept of form dictates content. Okay, we really want to be channeling that idea. And this can go back to thinking about how you handle your medium, right? If we start handling our medium in a really light way, maybe it starts to symbolically reference the way our images are being perceived. Maybe this is a light matter. Maybe it's not going to be as serious or taken as serious. If I also conversely start to really emphasize bold, rich colors, maybe this will add the heightened kind of drama that this particular scene might need, right? So there's always areas in terms of thinking about how we're handling our material to best suit and cultivate meaning for our image. All right, so always think about that, and especially we're going to be developing this project even further in terms of how to think about color and how to think about material and medium use for our images. All right, so I've got this area is pretty dry now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start to do some mixed media applications. So what I did first was just paint this with a simple kind of clean wash layer of gouache paint. I did some blotting here too, and I just worked wet on dry. You can actually go back in and start adding some other types of mark to this form. This could be really nice for developing clouds. You can go in here, and I'm just simply doing hash marks. Hash marks are essentially just a mark that goes straight up and down, or left and right, or vertical. So that's a hash mark, right? You can also do cross hatch marks, which is essentially making T or X shapes, okay, or a variety of all of them together to create a really well blended form. All right. Okay, so I'm going to actually just go in here and add some marks to this to create and cultivate maybe a little bit more just information to develop this space. I've also got some, if I can find it, hold on, it's buried. Okay, nope, that's not it, hold on. I've also got a white color pencil too that I can go back in here and add some highlights or add other marks like curvilinear marks to generate just some really nice light, sophisticated kind of marks, and just tone or tint the space accordingly. It's again adding some gray in here, neutralizing some of those colors, or adding white. All right, as you can see, that just heightened this area, and it really now looks like a pretty well developed sky space just with adding two different colors. Also too, this isn't necessarily in the project sheet, or I don't outline it a whole lot, but you can also, like I said, use some pen to outline these forms. My only thing is with pen, it's not going to work so well with color pencil, right? Because that color pencil has a wax on it. It's going to resist a little bit. So you just want to be careful with your crafting and how you're using it and when you're using it. So this could also be a nice area where maybe you start to emphasize certain characteristics, like if you have really detailed areas of a bee or insect or even bird or something that you're wanting to showcase, you're wanting to outline and go through those forms. All right, so this is going to be a quick material overview, talking about different ways to generate marks, to think about material, and once again, that idea of form dictates content. Also thinking about how we can incorporate different types of marks with mixed media materials, such as combining color pencil and gouache use, and also thinking about new techniques for painting with gouache. All right, this is going to take us to our end of the video. Of course, have fun working on your larger images. I can't wait to see those larger, complex colored pieces for your final painting product or drawing product of your completed pattern. Good luck, have fun, and happy drawing or painting.